The courtroom was quiet, except for the soft shuffle of papers and the occasional murmur from the audience. It was an ordinary day, with nothing out of the ordinary. The judge, a tall man in his late 50s, sat high on his bench. He had a reputation for being strict and stern, and everyone in the room respected his authority. His glasses were perched on the edge of his nose, and he looked over them as he glanced at the case file in front of him. His voice, when he spoke, was sharp and commanding. The door to the courtroom creaked open, and in walked Tommy Lee Jones. He didn't look like someone who was here for a movie premiere or a red carpet event. He looked serious, exactly like he did in all his roles. Tommy wore a dark suit, and his face was set in the same way he often looked in the movies: serious, intense, even a little grumpy. The judge took one look at him, then quickly turned his attention back to the paperwork in front of him. Without thinking too much, the judge made a light-hearted remark, almost as if to break the tension. "I see we have another serious man in the room today," he said, smiling a little. "You look like you're about to arrest someone." The judge chuckled, unaware that the man in front of him wasn't just a regular person. He didn't know that he was standing in front of a Hollywood legend. He didn't know that he was mocking someone who had starred in some of the most intense movies ever made. The room was quiet, but the judge didn't notice. He continued speaking, thinking it was just another regular day in court. Tommy Lee Jones stood still, not reacting immediately. His face was calm, but there was something behind his eyes that suggested he wasn't laughing. Tommy Lee Jones stood there, his expression unreadable. He didn't flinch at the judge's joke. He didn't laugh, didn't smile, not even a hint of amusement. He just stood still, his eyes steady, his face as serious as ever. The judge, still smiling from his comment, looked around the room to see if anyone else found it funny. The few people in the courtroom who had caught the joke gave polite chuckles, but there was a sense of tension hanging in the air. Maybe they felt something was off, but didn't know exactly what. Tommy didn't react in the way most people might have. He didn't get upset or make a scene. Instead, he just stayed silent. His face didn't give anything away, but his eyes, they told a different story. There was a flicker of something there, perhaps a hint of surprise, maybe a bit of confusion. But he didn't say a word. His posture remained straight, and he kept his hands clasped in front of him. The judge, meanwhile, seemed oblivious. He was still enjoying his own joke, thinking it was harmless fun. He glanced at Tommy once more, then continued with the case, now focusing on the matter at hand, but there was a subtle change in the air. The audience in the courtroom could feel it, even if they didn't fully understand what was happening. Tommy's silence wasn't the kind of silence that meant he was okay with the joke. It was the kind of silence that said he was thinking. He wasn't going to cause a scene, but it was clear he didn't appreciate the judge's comment. His calm demeanor made the whole situation even more uncomfortable. In the back of the room, a few people shifted nervously. They could sense the awkwardness creeping in. Some might have even wondered if the judge had just made a mistake, but no one said anything, and the judge kept talking as though nothing unusual had happened. He didn't seem to notice the change in atmosphere, or the fact that he might have just crossed a line. As the judge continued with the proceedings, he had no idea that he had just made a huge mistake. He went on, reading through the case, completely unaware of the weight of his words. Tommy Lee Jones, still silent, stood there, patiently waiting. The judge didn't know it, but he had just mocked one of Hollywood's most famous and serious actors, someone who was used to intense roles in movies like No Country for Old Men and The Fugitive. But then something happened. A low murmur spread through the courtroom, and a few people exchanged quick glances. The judge didn't notice right away, too focused on his paperwork. He went on, oblivious to the fact that the man in front of him was someone far beyond the usual courtroom visitors. It wasn't until a quiet voice from the back of the room broke through the judge's concentration. "That's Tommy Lee Jones," someone whispered to the judge. The words hung in the air for a moment, and the judge's eyes widened as the realization hit him. The man standing in front of him, the one he had just joked about, was a movie star, one of the most serious and respected actors in the industry. The judge froze for a moment. His mind raced as he tried to process what he had just done. Was this really the same Tommy Lee Jones from all those intense films? The judge's face turned a shade of red. He had just mocked one of Hollywood's biggest stars without even realizing it. He glanced over at Tommy, who still stood there, calm and collected, but with a faint trace of disappointment in his eyes. The judge's heart sank. How had he not recognized him? Tommy Lee Jones had a face that was hard to forget, especially if you were familiar with his movies. The judge was known for his sharp mind, but at this moment, he felt foolish. A nervous laugh escaped the judge's lips as he cleared his throat, trying to cover up his mistake. But it was too late. The damage was done. The judge knew that he had just insulted a man who was more than capable of making him look bad in front of the entire courtroom. The awkwardness in the air thickened. Everyone in the room could sense that something had gone terribly wrong. Tommy Lee Jones, however, remained silent. He wasn't going to make a scene, but the judge couldn't stop himself from wondering if this would be the moment everyone would remember. The judge's face reddened even more as he realized his mistake. His hands trembled slightly as he cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. The room was still, with everyone waiting for what would come next. Tommy Lee Jones stood there, unmoving, giving the judge no sign of how he felt about the situation. The judge's mind raced as he struggled to find the right words. He knew he had to do something. This wasn't just any ordinary mistake. He had just mocked a man who could easily be a force in the courtroom, let alone the movie world. The judge was aware that this was a serious misstep, and the tension in the room made it clear that it couldn't be ignored. "Mr. Jones," the judge began, his voice no longer light or amused. "I must apologize for my earlier comment. It was thoughtless of me." He paused, his eyes briefly meeting Tommy's. "I had no idea who you were, and I certainly didn't mean to disrespect you." The judge's words were sincere, but his nerves were clear. He was stumbling through his apology, trying to recover from the awkward moment. It wasn't easy, and the room was still filled with an uncomfortable silence. He wasn't sure if his apology would be enough to fix what had just happened, but he had to try. Tommy Lee Jones didn't react immediately. His face was still calm, his expression unreadable, but the moment was thick with tension, and everyone could feel it. The judge, desperately trying to regain control of the room, quickly added, "I hope you can accept my apology. I meant no offense." Finally, after a long moment of silence, Tommy spoke. His voice was low but clear. "It's all right," he said, his tone even. "It was an honest mistake." His words were calm, polite, but they didn't seem to hold much warmth. Tommy's voice carried an air of professionalism, and it was clear he wasn't the kind of person to blow things out of proportion. But even as he spoke, there was a sense of formality in his tone. He wasn't laughing off the mistake, he wasn't brushing it under the rug either. Tommy had accepted the apology, but it was evident that he didn't think the situation was something to joke about. The judge, relieved but still uncomfortable, tried to lighten the mood. "Well, I suppose that means I don't need to worry about being arrested then," he said, attempting to make a joke to ease the tension. But Tommy didn't smile. He didn't react to the joke, instead he gave a small nod, acknowledging the apology, but not engaging in the humor. It was clear that Tommy wasn't going to pretend that everything was fine just because the judge had apologized. The air in the courtroom was still heavy with awkwardness, and the judge could feel it. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the judge tried to steer the situation back to business. The case would continue, but the earlier tension lingered. The judge knew that his mistake would be something everyone would remember, whether they liked it or not. Tommy Lee Jones remained calm and composed, as if he had dealt with awkward situations like this before. His face didn't show anger or frustration, but it didn't show warmth either. He simply nodded, accepting the judge's apology with a level of professionalism that seemed to ease some of the tension in the room. The judge, though relieved, couldn't help but feel that Tommy hadn't fully forgiven the situation. Tommy wasn't the type to hold grudges, but he wasn't going to pretend like the judge's mistake hadn't happened. His response, though polite, was too distant to say things were completely fine. "It's all right," Tommy said again, his voice still even. "You didn't know who I was." His words seemed to carry a hint of resignation, as if he had been in situations like this before. But even as he spoke, it was clear that his calm wasn't a sign of forgiveness, it was just a sign that he wasn't interested in making a scene. The judge nodded quickly, his eyes flickering nervously. He tried to offer a reassuring smile, but Tommy didn't return it. Instead, Tommy's gaze remained steady, almost as if he were waiting for the whole thing to pass. There was no hint of humor in his eyes, no trace of amusement. He was a professional, and he wasn't going to let something as trivial as a courtroom mistake derail him. The judge, still trying to recover from his error, fumbled through a few words. "Well, thank you for understanding," he said, his voice a little shaky. "I hope we can proceed without any more interruptions." Tommy gave a small nod, not acknowledging the joke or the apology any further. He didn't need to say more, his silence spoke volumes. He wasn't angry, but he wasn't going to make the judge feel better about the situation either. Tommy was a man of few words, and in this moment, he made it clear that he wasn't going to allow the judge's mistake to overshadow the seriousness of the matter at hand. As the judge hesitated, Tommy's professionalism set the tone. He wasn't going to let the situation drag on any longer. His reaction, or lack of it, kept the focus on the case, rather than the uncomfortable moment. Tommy didn't need to prove anything, his calm demeanor said it all. As the judge and Tommy Lee Jones exchanged their brief uncomfortable words, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The tension was palpable. The audience, which had been quietly watching, now seemed unsure of how to react. Some glanced at each other nervously, while others fidgeted in their seats, trying to ignore the awkwardness that filled the room. The judge, now flustered, attempted to carry on with the proceedings. His voice, though still authoritative, lacked the usual confidence. He glanced at Tommy once more, clearly trying to regain some control of the situation, but the damage had been done. The room couldn't simply go back to normal after that moment. In the back of the room, a few people whispered. "Did you see who that was?" One person asked quietly. "That's Tommy Lee Jones, the actor." A small group of people nodded in surprise, their eyes flicking toward the actor. The judge's mistake was the talk of the courtroom now, and there was a sense that the room had collectively realized what had just happened. The judge, though trying his best to move past the incident, couldn't ignore the subtle shift in the mood. He was aware now that everyone in the room knew what had just transpired. The earlier tension seemed to linger, and the uncomfortable feeling hung over the courtroom like a heavy cloud. Even though Tommy remained composed, the energy in the room had shifted, and it was clear that this moment would not be forgotten anytime soon. Some of the people in the courtroom may have tried to suppress their laughter. After all, what had happened was almost too absurd to ignore. A judge had mocked Tommy Lee Jones, and now everyone knew who he was. The fact that Tommy had remained so calm about it made the whole situation even more awkward. The judge, trying his best to stay focused on the case, gave a nervous glance at Tommy once more. "Mr. Jones," he began, his voice less certain than before. "We can proceed now." He quickly turned back to the case, hoping to steer things back to the matter at hand. But even as the judge tried to move on, the courtroom couldn't forget the brief but memorable moment of tension. It wasn't just the judge who had been affected by the incident. The room, filled with whispers and quiet glances, knew that this was a moment they would talk about long after the trial was over.